So how do we do it? How did the world change so dramatically in the past 200 years? And what lessons can we learn to continue this and to spread this prosperity to everyone? We need a framework. A production function turns inputs into outputs. We're going to simplify the whole economy to just 3 inputs: labor, physical capital, like machines, equipment, and buildings, and then human capital, the creation of education and training. We throw those 3 things into a production process, combine them together, that's the function bit, and then it spits out GDP, or economic output. Formally, this is a simple equation. We take a function of these 3 inputs. That's what the F with the parentheses means. So we're not assuming if we're adding these things up or multiplying them together or any particular mathematical form. But after they're combined, they'll spit out a capital Y, which is real GDP. There's a few properties to this equation. We assume that there's constant returns to scale. That means if we double the labor, double the human capital, double the physical capital, we will get double the GDP. This is like making a cake. If you double the flour and sugar and chocolate, you'll yield double the amount of cakes. We also assume diminishing marginal returns. That means if we only increase capital and not increase the other components, the increments of economic output are going to be smaller. Likewise with a cake, if you increase water but don't increase the flour, you're going to get less marginal cake contribution from each unit of additional water. So let's go through these 3 one at a time. The first and most important is labor. We measure this in total hours worked. Each labor hour performed by a human. The more people, the more GDP. But this alone will not increase GDP per capita or output per person. We'll need to look at the other ingredients for that. Nevertheless, changes in the labor force and changes in the population are very important to pay attention to. The biggest change over the past few decades, and especially looking into the future, will be an aging population around the globe. This data is for the past century in the United States. By 1920, only around 5% of the total population was age 65 and older, whereas by 2020, it's well over 15% of the population. As a higher share of the population is no longer working, this has significant implications for the share of the economy going towards healthcare and supporting the retired. The other demographic story over the past century is the dramatic increase in the female labor force participation rate. Around 30% of women aged 20 and over were working in 1950. Then it experienced dramatic growth until the year 2000, where it peaked at 60%. And at the time of the recording in August 23, it's at 59%. The next component we'll look at is human capital. So it's not just that a worker is working, but this lets us know how a worker is working. Number 1, literacy is fundamental. Literacy rates across the globe are eons better than they were 200 years ago. This allows for the workforce to do more complicated things. Next, formal education. The United States pioneered universal public high school education, and they also lead in the world in the share of population going to college. This has been one of the driving forces behind the U.S. being at the forefront of economic and technological progress. And the final component of human capital is on-the-job training. Training takes time, and building that knowledge will yield returns for the years and decades to come. Finally, physical capital, which we represent by a K. We already use C twice for cost and for consumption, so we had to use something else. Plus, this guy wrote a famous book. His first name starts with a K, but I think it's because capital in German is spelt with a K. Physical capital are going to be the tools of the trade, the machinery. It will make each labor hour more efficient. Over the long run, this has been a complement to labor. If you're mining materials, what would you rather use? Baskets to bring rocks down the mountain? Or a wheel tractor scraper the size of a building on wheels? One worker can do so much more when given the proper amount of capital. So those are the 3 main ingredients. Let's talk about how we put them together. First is this notion of productivity, driven by technological progress. It's defined as doing more with the same amount of inputs. So doing more with the same or doing the same with less inputs. To make more wheat with the same amount of land. To make the same amount of energy using less water. Would you rather travel in a plane with a propeller or in a jet engine? The speed difference is enormous. Putting these things together, productivity helps human capital, physical capital, and labor all come together to create more economic output. We're going to put all these together in a simple graph. On the horizontal axis, we have physical capital per worker. So this is the number of shovels per employee, or the total amount of software per worker. And on the vertical axis, we have output per worker. More output per worker means more economic growth. This is a graphical representation of our production function. We take in physical capital per worker, and it spits out output per worker. And what do we notice? As the economy accumulates more and more capital, it experiences more and more output per worker. but there's also a diminishing returns to that physical capital. Gaining more capital per worker is not enough on its own to achieve strong levels of economic growth. Eventually, things will start slowing down. But this does tell us a lot for what's going to happen between countries that have a lot of capital versus countries that don't. If a country starts off with a relatively small amount of capital, they will increase their economic growth per worker by a large margin. Copy that over there, and we can see that if a country already has a lot of capital and acquires the exact same amount of additional capital, the increase in output per worker will be there, but the effect is much smaller. This model was first developed in the 1950s by the very famous economist Robert Solow, so we call it the Solow growth model. He ended up winning the Nobel in 1987, and today he's still alive at the time of this recording at 99 years old. This particular picture is from 2008. One of the insights of the Solow growth model is that capital accumulation can't sustain long-term economic growth. It's an essential component, but it doesn't tell the whole story. I mean, you start off building all the bridges you can think of, and then eventually you literally start building bridges to nowhere. Ain't gonna do anything for economic productivity. To infinity and beyond! If physical capital has diminishing returns, then what makes a country grow richer? From Solow's conclusions, we must find other ways to improve efficiency, namely better technology, new techniques, new methods, and better institutions. If we do those things, then we will have a new production function. These improvements will give us a new production function, so that at an exact same level of capital per worker, we can yield a higher output per worker. Another way of saying this is that capital deepening can only get you so far. We need no technology, we need better institutions, we need a more educated workforce. Much more recently, many economists have been very concerned about institutions, claiming that it's not necessarily the quality of the land or the natural resources, but rather the ways humans organize society that determines long-run economic growth. We generally find that countries with good property rights promote innovation. I have to take a very quick aside on this. None of these rules are universal. Often we have to ask ourselves property rights of which kind of property. To see the importance of this, let's go back to the 1830s and 40s. In the South, many slaveholders argued under the virtues of property rights that they should preserve the institution of slavery. However, most economic theorists long have argued against slavery because it's a violation of individual liberty. Adam Smith explicitly spent pages and pages arguing against the institution. John Stuart Mill in the 1840s explicitly fought against the idea of supporting slavery. The economic discipline came out of a concern for individual liberty and the freedom to be free from external oppression. Not only through the choice to determine your own economic freedom, through free participation in a market, choosing what you want to buy, choosing what you not want to buy, choosing who you do business with, who you don't do business with, but also for the economic flourishing and therefore the freedom of choice that comes as a product of that. One cannot be free to choose what they want to do if they are poor. Nor were any of these economists arguing for freedom of the market in all circumstances. Collective institutions must be preserved in order for everyone to have the equal opportunity to participate in society. Nevertheless, we find a balanced protection of property rights allows people to get returns from the risks they take, and therefore they take the time and investment to innovate. Political stability is a necessity. It creates a good business environment. People have more trust that the future is going to be well, and therefore are willing to make costly investments today that will yield returns over the next decade or two. Why build an expensive machinery that will last 30 years if you think a revolution or a political swing is going to destroy it in the next 5? We need inclusive institutions to produce economic prosperity. We need everybody to participate, and we need everybody to benefit from that participation. Most problematic are extractive institutions, when it allows for the powerful to hoard all of that economic surplus. When an institution is extracted, it only has an incentive to take what is already there for a very small sliver of society. So the next question is, where did those extracted institutions come from? On the one hand, governments can become corrupt, serving the privileged elites, rather than investing in general economic prosperity. In the context of the global history, a large source of extractive institutions were imposed by colonial powers. Colonizer would go into the land, set up governments and other institutions for the explicit purpose of extracting the maximum amount of wealth out of the country. What was the institutional legacy left behind? Rather than extracting the country's wealth to be led towards external forces, the extraction happened from the country's masses towards the internal corrupt elite, utilizing the institutions left behind by the formal colonizing. I think it's important to note the difference between engaging in consensual, mutually beneficial trade versus a military colonial conquest. In the context of the story with China, we're talking about them limiting the amount of mutually beneficial trade. Trade is one such inclusive institution. This is a very dramatic example. That little ship right there, that's one of Columbus's ships. You know, the guy that sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and among other things was considered a technical progress of the time, Columbus's ship was nothing, because that other ship is a contemporary Chinese ship. In 1402, Emperor Yongle responded to foreign trade on a big scale. He commissioned Admiral Zheng He, who undertook 6 missions across South Asia, Arabia, and into Africa. We're talking 27,000 men, 62 treasure ships, and 190 smaller ships. In 1433, all overseas trade was banned. There was a power struggle between the merchants and the central government, and therefore by 1436, the construction of sea-going ships was made illegal. Well, what was the consequence? China became poorer. Here I got a graph comparing the change in GDP per capita from 1685 through 1962. And I have 4 Eastern Asian countries for comparison. Japan by the 1960s was very wealthy. Their GDP per capita was 600% larger than it was in the 1600s. South Korea was still recovering from the Korean War, but then nevertheless had a GDP per capita 100% larger. Vietnam remained poor, but still had an economy 67% larger. China in 1962 had a GDP per capita 27% lower than it was in 1685. We're talking in the middle of the 20th century, China's one of the poorest countries on the globe. Zooming in, we can particularly see this change compared to the year 1400. 100 years later, in 1500, the GDP per capita was down by 14%, and it didn't get better for the next hundreds of years. Throughout these centuries, China's GDP per capita was lower than it had been in the 1600s. Blocking yourself off from the rest of the world may seem good from a short-run perspective, but it has drastic, dramatic, heart-wrenching consequences over the long run.